You can support this project by subscribing on Spotify for £3 a month.
Welcome to the Nostalgia Podcast with me, Sebastian Morello, my friend and co-host Brian Scarf, and this week with Fr Robert Nixon, a monk of the New Noria Benedictine Monastery in Australia. Thanks so much for joining us, Fr Robert.
Sebastian and Brian, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Let me just introduce Fr Robert to our listeners. As well as being a monk and a priest, he's an experienced educator, musician, composer, and liturgist, as well as a prolific translator. His works include the Resurrection series, published by Tan Books, which currently total 13 volumes, The Devil's Bagpipe, The True Life of Martin Luther, which is published by Sensus Fidelium Press, and a series of books and tracts by Hadean Press covering some of the stranger aspects of the medieval Catholic tradition, including fascinating titles such as Brontomantia, Prognostication by Thunder by the Venerable Bede, and The Magical Amulets of the Ancient Sages by the great Benedictine abbot Johannes Trithemius. So I'm very excited that we get to speak to you today, but perhaps you can tell us a little bit about New Noria, what makes it particularly special, and perhaps something about its wonderful library.
So New Noria is the oldest religious community in Australia. We date back to 1846. Now, at that point in time, there had been revolutions in Spain, which meant that a number of Spanish monks, a large number of Spanish monks, found themselves dispossessed of their home monasteries. And of course, Benedictines have a vow of stability. We normally remain within whatever monastery we join. But they took this as a sign from God that they were uprooted and that therefore they were called to missionary work. Now, at that time, the colony of Western Australia was newly founded. It had been only founded about a decade or so earlier. So Western Australia would have perhaps seemed like the most remote part of the world. So two monks, Rosendo Salvado and Jose Serra, both discussed, and they thought, well, let's go and start a mission in Western Australia. And they came out here with nothing more than the blessing and permission of the Pope and their own determination to get things underway. So we were founded what was outside of the colony of Perth at the time, which was very small. It was only 1,000 or so people, approximately 150 kilometers to the north. So at this stage, Western Australia was largely unpopulated by European settlers, and it was literally no man's land. This monastery was founded. They diligently recruited young men from Spain to come out here to do missionary work, to try the monastic life. And they introduced to the indigenous people of the area not only the Catholic faith, but also literacy, learning, skills in farming and trades and so forth. So we sprang up to being a kind of monastic village. We are like a little old Spanish village in the middle of the Australian outback. So it's quite a striking thing. And And we have continued to this present day. We're a small community at the moment. We consist now of only half a dozen monks. Nevertheless, we continue with the observance of the rule of Saint Benedict. The daily schedule of prayer is central to our life. As well as this, we offer the ministry of hospitality, spiritual guidance, and so forth.
So I've heard rumors that you have a very special library.
We do indeed. We have a library which dates back to 1846. However, the oldest books in our library, we have a considerable collection dating from the 16th century. The very oldest one we have discovered is actually from the 11th century, a manuscript, of course. And this library numbers over 80,000 volumes. And the fascinating thing about the library is because it's been catalogued, or people have attempted to catalogue it at various stages, to this day, it's not fully catalogued. So we have this bewildering variety of books. And I think about 20 different languages are represented here. Primarily, of course, Latin, Spanish, and Greek, and in more recent decades, English. But we have a very lot of strange and curious books, and I enjoy endless hours when I have the opportunity of just browsing through the library. Certainly, when I was a novice, and I didn't have quite so many responsibilities as I do today. This was one of my great delights, to spend a morning or afternoon looking through the library. So it's a real treasure, and we have people visiting who come and look at things and look around. And whenever I take people on a tour of our library here, which I do not infrequently, it's virtually impossible to get them to leave at the end of the tour. It's so fascinating.
I imagine interesting. So I first became aware of your work, perhaps in a slightly unusual way for a Catholic. So I have an interest in niche publishers, unusual small presses. I have an interest in sort of the history of Western esotericism. So I often browse the books of very fringe publishers. And I began to notice a series of medieval texts coming to my attention, where the titles themselves were fascinating and seemed to draw me to lesser known aspects of the Catholic tradition. But I kept noticing that they were translated by this mysterious Benedictine monk, Father Robert Nixon. So I think the very first book of yours I came across was The Magical Amulets of the Ancient Sages. And this was a while back when I started to become aware of what an interesting individual this particular abbot was. I have on my shelves some of his works on incubation and other fascinating subjects. How did you encounter the work of Johannes Trithemius, and what do you make of this individual?
Yeah, so Trithemius for me is a very important figure, and I should say, when I first encountered him, when I was a youth, I loved reading Gothic fiction, and in the work Frankenstein, where Victor Frankenstein is first embarking on his medical career, or when his interest in medicine first develops, he reads these works of Trithemius, Agrippa, and people like that. And when you read these works of Gothic fiction, of course there are often references which seem to be relatively obscure, quotations in Latin and so forth. And my own tendency is to be fascinated by whatever is obscure. And so this brought me into contact with Trithemius at an early age. I guess I was only a teenager at this point. And I discovered that he was a Benedictine monk, and he worked really hard to develop what was probably the leading monastic library in Germany at the time. He entered the Benedictine order when it was in a very degenerate state. This was in the 1400s, and the Franciscans, of course, the Dominicans had largely taken over as the most active orders in the church. The Benedictines were kind of in severe decline, but he joined a very tiny Benedictine monastery. He, in fact, had run away from home and was trapped in a blizzard. And he sought refuge from the blizzard, and it was in this Benedictine monastery. Now, this Benedictine monastery at the time, as I said, was in a somewhat degenerate state. The library was very poor, not many monks and so forth. Within a year, he had become abbot of this monastery, which is almost a miracle in itself. How could that possibly happen? It happened in the case of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, but he was quite a different case. And so the fascinating thing about Trithemius is he collected books on all different topics, and particularly the obscure books. What was the kind of Kabbalistic or occult knowledge at the time? And this was the era in which Hebrew texts, Arabic texts, and so forth were just coming into circulation. So he's someone who's fascinated me, and I came across these texts of his that hadn't been translated and were actually relatively accessible, a collection of writings on the properties of magical amulets. And I just knew that this was something which was very interesting to share. I've translated, by the way, another one of his works, The Illustrious Authors of the Benedictine Order, which is a compilation of biographies of the authors of the Benedictine Order since our foundation. This is regarded as one of the authoritative source books for information on medieval writers. That is not through Haydean Press, but is through Wipf and Stock, who is another publisher with whom I work sometimes.
Fascinating. So it would be our listeners would potentially be quite perplexed by the subject matters that we're beginning to cover, that the Abbot Trithemius is writing on. How would you offer listeners who are from sort of a Catholic background, potentially with quite a traditional leaning, but have a suspicion of the term occult or the term esoteric? What would you say?
So you know what I would say to that is what he was researching at the time was basically the science, the philosophy, the medicine, the discoveries, the religious discoveries, talking about angels and so forth, coming through study of Jewish literature. Now, the term occult, in its Latin form, occultus simply means something which is not obvious. And so we find this term used quite freely by the patristic authors, talking about the hidden meaning of the gospel or the hidden meaning of a prophecy. So in itself, it's nothing to be worried about. It just means something which is not obvious. Its negative connotations came to the fore largely as a consequence of not Catholicism, but Protestantism. Because the Protestant approach, the Catholic approach to learning has always been Catholic or eclectic. We're not afraid of any of the discoveries, any of the insights or approaches that might be tested. Whereas the Protestant approach was somewhat more puritanical. It said, you've got the Bible, that's enough. You don't need to know anything more. And, you know, someone like Luther and his followers took this to extreme, saying you don't even need to read Cicero or Plato. You just need the Bible, that's it. And because of this, they falsely represented Catholics in a kind of slanderous campaign, saying Catholics, they're praying to saints and angels, using incense, rosary beads. This is occult. And this was where the negative reaction to the term occult and esoteric came into being. So if we look at what might be called the occult writings, the writings about, for example, interpreting the meaning of the stars or the property of stones or herbs, we find this in saints, the Venerable Bede, Saint Hildegard of Bingen, and so forth. So it's nothing which Catholics need to be frightened of. Of course, there is this, this side of invoking demonic spirits, but this is something which is quite separate from what these authors were doing. And of course, they would never recommend anything like that. And no sane person would. But simply the investigation of the hidden properties of nature, of our world, and of God. And, the Catholic understanding of the world is that it's not simply matter versus spirit. Spirit, mysticism is what goes on essentially in your mind or your soul. The rest of the world just works according to mechanical physical laws. That, Brian, is the Protestant approach. The Catholic approach is to see reality as kind of subjective encounter, which is both physical and mystical, both at the same time. In fact, there's no real distinction between the two. Because you think about it, the world which each of us inhabits is primarily the world of our own spirit, of our own mind.
That's fascinating. So what you're describing is more like a poetic structure of reality. You might say a poetic metaphysics, where relationality is far more important than sort of separated individuality.
Absolutely, and the truth of this approach, I think, is abundantly clear. Two people can encounter precisely the same physical reality, and each of them receive a completely different experience from it, a completely different meaning from it. So what are they really encountering? We're living in a world of our own meaning and connections. And I think we need to move beyond the materialistic versus spiritual metaphysics ontology, which is imprinted into us from an early age. And I believe that this is actually a consequence of Protestantism, then Puritanism and rationalism, which actually stems from this, the view that the world in itself, life, nature, is not mystical but purely mechanical, and the mystical is a completely different realm. You look at the writings of the saints, the Catholics, throughout the Middle Ages, and there's miracles, angels, visions, and so forth. And this, I believe, constitutes the real substance of life. I think this is the great value of, of course, I'm not going to say the occult scene as a whole is something which I could recommend people get into. But I say one thing about it, that it admits or it appreciates the reality of the spiritual and mystical dimension of existence. And in my opinion, that is a lot less dangerous than materialistic reductionism.
Right. And it seems to me one of the ways that I interpret something like the New Age movement is that it's very much picked up some of the treasures that the church has lost. Yeah. And without the structures of sort of doctrinal teaching, doesn't have any of those protections, but is very much engaged in things that would have made a lot more sense to a medieval saint or layman or cleric.
Absolutely. I feel, of the New Age thing, on the whole, if I go into a bookshop and look at the New Age section, most of the writings don't impress me too much, just on a scholarly level. But having said that, it does reflect this type of yearning for spiritual, for mystical realities, an underlying sense that the physical paradigm of the universe is not something which reconciles itself to our lived experience. And, you know, to be fair, the church has, for various reasons, alienated a lot of people, you know, and so they're looking for this spirituality, and they go beyond the bounds of the church. You know, so there's people who are interested in angels and so forth, who read books about angels. They probably wouldn't, a lot of these people probably wouldn't read a book about God, though, you know, which to me is a kind of paradoxical position, because, you know, and one thing I would say about this phenomena is, if we look at the church before the Reformation, you know, people think about the Catholic Church today and think, oh, there are a bunch of, you know, doctrines which are rigid and formally defined. Throughout most of the Middle Ages, that in fact was not the case. So doctrine was seen as a fluid thing, as something reflecting the sense of the faithful and lived experiences. And this actually is still the case. There are different kinds of piety and devotions and practices within the Catholic Church across the world. And we are not, in the Catholic Church, we're not in the business of imposing uniformity, which is, I think, where some people get it wrong with the Catholic Church. You know, you go into, and I think this is actually represented in the physical design of cathedrals, that they're complex, they're baroque, they're overflowing with images. And these images are not, at the end of the day, all wrapped up together in a neat synthesis, which doesn't reflect reality at all. I mean, one of the things of our modern Western minds is we're always trying to arrive at a synthesis or a solution, but that is not what life is.
Interesting. That reminds me the way that the great Gothic cathedrals are asymmetrical in many ways. You'll have one tower at a certain height, and its sister tower will be at a different height, a different shape. The building can look different on one side than it would on the other, because it hasn't been centrally planned, or every generation has contributed a different set of designs to an overall theme. It's still coherent
Absolutely.
and harmonious,
Yeah.
but not centrally sort of controlled by one individual in the way that we sort of maybe even neo-Gothic is.
Yeah, you know, and I believe that this is so important, because it's uniting human architecture and art to nature, which is basically asymmetrical, you know, that it is complex and fluid and so forth. To my mind, if we look at church designs, it actually is very illuminating. I believe that the Catholic Church perhaps went through its lowest period in the latter half of the 20th century. You look at churches from this time, they're low, horizontal, undecorated, utilitarian, and it's actually what people don't want in a church.
Right. Devoid of any sort of subtle symbolism.
Yeah, and I think that this was because of I guess like an exaggerated attempt at democratization, you know. And to me, democratization is always the first step in tyranny.
Interesting.
So, yeah, you know, and I am a great admirer of the Middle Ages. I believe that was probably, at least in Europe, the richest period of human history. And I believe that people who lived in the Middle Ages, whether they were peasants or kings or knights or monks, were probably happier and healthier than people in the modern world.
Because their relationship was to the spiritual world was so integrated to their everyday lives. That's how I would interpret it.
Yeah. So it meant that whatever individual, however humble their station in the world, did actually have this direct connection to the infinite, to the eternal. to glory beyond all imagining. And, I think this is something which people don't have so much today. They don't realize the internal, the spiritual is actually what determines our happiness or otherwise in life.
Interesting. So you say that people who have been left behind by the church in many ways, but have a deep yearning for the spiritual, might be reading books on angels that they find in esoteric bookstores. And I've got in front of me your translation of the Imperatrix Aeterna.
Yes.
Which I think is a fascinating book. It's probably among all the books I have, the book that has the highest Mariology. It's something that's truly alien to an attempt to reconcile Protestant and Catholic views of Mary that have dominated the 20th century. Tell me some more about this work.
Absolutely. So these were stories which I absolutely loved, and my first approach was to work with a fairly traditional Catholic publisher, but they said these stories are actually a bit too weird or theologically ambiguous, and so I shared it with Elizabeth from Heyday Press. And these stories are the other kind of eccentric miracles that are recorded during the Middle Ages, which then later generations, particularly in our modern era, found a little bit too strange, and kind of wrote them out or dropped them, and the thing about this wonderful high Mariology, and I'll just explain what that is. So low Mariology treats Mary as basically just a good Jewish girl who was chosen by God to raise his son, Jesus Christ. So she offers us an example of obedience, humility. Now, I'm not saying that she doesn't offer those, because of course she does, to perfection. But the high Mariology is to focus on her on a more metaphysical aspect. We believe that she was crowned as the Queen of Heaven and the Empress of the Angels. Now, a lot of Catholics actually don't like using those expressions anymore. They kind of avoid it. But to me, these are wonderful treasures, because if we think about it, Jesus Christ was the very union of divinity and humanity. He was simultaneously both God and a human being. Now, that is a kind of awe-inspiring thought, but it actually points to a deeper reality within our human nature, that each of us is not this small ego self running around in the world and being happy and sad and worrying about things and so forth, but we are connected in our fundamental essence to God himself. When we reduce ourselves to who we really are, the I am, this is the same as God. I am who am. Now, Mary has a unique relationship to this incarnate God, because he was flesh of her flesh. His DNA, the DNA of Christ, literally was identical with that of Mary. And we find traditionally Mary is described as being an immaculate mirror of the divine glory. And there's, you think about, she remains the mother of God, which is a pretty awesome thing to think about, and we sometimes find that expression, I think, in the Tao Te Ching, where it says, what is the Tao? I think it is even God's mother, or something like that. So God will not deny her anything. In a sense, she has maternal authority over God. Now, this is like a loving authority. It's the authority which actually springs from a union of will. So it's not like she's telling God what to do, but some of the stories present it in this kind of way, which is mixing up these anthropomorphizations of spiritual realities. So, for example, there's one story there where a certain man is down on his luck and he is led to blaspheme Christ. The devil says, great, now I want you to blaspheme the Blessed Virgin. And he absolutely refuses to do that. You know, that has reached his limit. And then later on, the Blessed Virgin holding the infant Christ says, you have to forgive him because he wouldn't blaspheme me. And Christ says, no, but he blasphemed me. And Mary says, I won't pick you up again unless you forgive him. And so to me, that's a wonderful image. And she's pleading for us before God himself. So I think we should, as Catholics, we should fully embrace this and recognize also that the psychology of our human beings, we relate to things in both a masculine and a feminine way. You know, and we can't say God is a man. No. So when we see the feminine face of God, this, for Catholics, is generally conveyed through the Blessed Virgin Mary. And to say this is not heresy, because in our song she's described as the immaculate mirror of God, the image of the divine glory.
That's extremely interesting. For the sake of our listeners, I just want to say that Sebastian is having some really irritating technical problems and possibly won't make another reappearance on this recording. So that's why he's very quiet, despite the fact that he always has exceptionally interesting contributions. But we must go on. It occurred to me that these stories have sort of a magical quality, and that there seems to be a common web of ideas emerging with the 20th century sociological philosophy that came out of the Russian Orthodox Church, which saw Mary's relationship to the divine wisdom as being extremely intimate. That there was sort of debate as to exactly how she relates, and a degree of unfolding of both an uncreated divine wisdom and a created divine wisdom, and the created divine wisdom as being kind of in between God and creation, in the kind of metaxou, as the Greeks might say, and that it's this Marian quality, potentially a glimpse of the new creation, that lends magic or enchantment, its licit and divine elements, that it's through the purification of the material world, which is exemplified in Mary, that matter no longer behaves as a dead slave that's to be tortured, as somebody like Francis Bacon might say, to have its secrets revealed, but rather reality begins to behave as a loved woman, as natura, as the school of Chartres might say, and so this relational element between us and the divine wisdom in the world around us comes out in Mary, and that's how I interpret these magical stories.
Absolutely, you know, and I think if we think about what we're told in the Beatitudes, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The Blessed Virgin Mary was pure in heart beyond anyone else. You know, and this, of course, affected her relationship with the rest of the world. And I think most people will be able to relate to this experience. You know, we all have, perhaps to varying degrees, times of purity or innocence and so forth. And when we attain to that state, then suddenly the world becomes magical. Things actually work out properly. Things go according to the way you will, and they're more or less fluid. And this is not just things, but it's also other people, you know. And the contrast of this is if you're kind of angry and corrupt and resentful, and then suddenly the world seems to be bumping into you and other people rubbing up against you and nothing going according to plan. So one thing I really recommend, and this is based on my experience as a monk, to cultivate purity of heart. And of course, even monks, we can't cultivate perfect purity of heart. I mean, we get busy or stressed or tempted or whatever. But at the same time, to be diligently keeping it as a goal. And if you start each day with this kind of purity of heart, then the day suddenly becomes magical. Then miracles happen. And there are easy ways in which you can cultivate this purity of heart. You don't necessarily have to become a monk or whatever, but practicing meditation each day for a certain period of time, trying to moderate one's physical appetites and indulgences and so forth, and consciously practicing restraint, humility, and silence, and a certain flexibility within oneself. You go with the flow of other people. For us, monastic obedience means we basically do whatever we're asked to do when we asked to do it, without necessarily evaluating and certainly without resisting. And when a person does this, when they become fluid to the will of God, then suddenly the world becomes fluid to them. And I think this is exemplified to the utmost degree in the Blessed Virgin Mary. There was literally nothing that she could ask God for or desire which would not be granted to her. And the reason for this was not that she was pushy or aggressive, or even that she necessarily did heroic works of virtue, outstanding things, or outstanding works of fasting and asceticism, but it was this purity. And I think this is something which Catholics value so much. I think a lot of people who are interested in the occult scene, not all of them, of course, but a lot of them also, value this and understand this.
Yes, that reminds me of a book I read. I believe it was called Rosicrucian Magic, and the author seems to have sort of a deep understanding of the Christian tradition, but sees themselves as being outside of it. And he was describing a year-long ritual he undertook of self-purification, in which every day he spent hours by himself in sort of meditation, but also slowly building his own coffin by hand in order to prepare for death as part of this year-long ritual. And I was just struck by how seriously he took this process, and how often could I say, as a Catholic, who I like to think I take my faith seriously, but how often have I ever dedicated such a long period of time or with such a degree of seriousness to the idea of self-purification? And so I think it's very interesting that you bring that up, because keeping our the generosity of heart open to see that outside, there's much to be benefited from. But it also made me think of back to the Marian question, the purity of heart. Why is it so important that there's this feminine aspect to the purity of heart? And it seems to me that part of the tradition is if we go a theme we pick up on this podcast quite often, the division between the lower reasoning faculty of the ratio and the higher reasoning faculty of the intellectus. The intellectus is the feminine reasoning faculty and is purely passive. It receives, and it is in a pure state. If it's not damaged by vice or clouded by ignorance of the lower faculty, it is ready for divine illumination. And so this feminine aspect of devotion seems to point in many ways not only to an interior hidden anatomy of man, but also I think in the way that the microcosm and the macrocosm relate to each other. It also speaks about the cosmos in a greater sense. And so not only individual devotion to the highest of the feminine, but the divine feminine that Mary is revealed to be, but doing that on a corporate basis, not as the church proper, as a nation, as a city. Those things could have truly transformatory effects. It seems that is part of the great genius of the Middle Ages, and part of why we're so lost. Even though I believe that the Catholic faith is the church that Christ planted, it's eclipsed its own Mariology in many ways. And
yes, it has. And this occurred actually. I guess it occurred most strongly within the 20th century. And there was at this stage in the 20th century, there was actually a movement to shift the Catholic Church more towards a Protestant approach, to say, well, what does it say about Mary in the Bible? Not all that much, to be fair. So, to try to cut things back, to make Mary just a good Jewish girl who happened to be the human mother of the person of Jesus, and not so much the Queen of the Angels and the Mother of God. So I believe we need to recapture this mysterious element. And as you said, it points to the feminine working of the intellect, or the feminine identification of the passive intellect. And this is perhaps something which all Westerners, male and female alike, we're ingrained to be doers, to make things happen. If you want to see change, go out there and make the change. If you're not happy about something, complain, start a petition, whatever. Whereas we don't, by doing that, we're actually placing ourselves in opposition to God and to the world, and then fundamentally to ourself as well. That if we can recapture some of this this approach of being a witness, that the world, that life is unfolding before us as a glorious gift from God, that we are not actually in control. And time and time again, I'm convinced of this reality. People imagine they're in control, and it doesn't make them happy. But to go with whatever happens as the will of God, and of course in Eastern philosophies, the inevitable working out of karma, and to realize that the self which acts and suffers and enjoys in this world, in fact, is not our true self. Our true self is the immortal self made in the very image of God. This is what we need to reconnect with, I believe, to rediscover this happiness. And certainly the figure of Mary as a kind of perfect exemplar of this woman who is immensely powerful, unimaginably powerful and strong, but not as a consequence of massive effort or willpower, but rather as a consequence of this purity. And one of the things you talked about, cultivating purity of heart and of mind, through my experience as a monk, I'm increasingly convinced that it's not the product of concerted willpower. Certainly there is some willpower involved, but it's actually more just making a decision, And to give you an example, a person who says, during the season of Lent, I'm going to give up something. I don't know, it might be giving up drinking alcohol. They've actually set up a dichotomy between, their desire to do it and their desire not to do it. A better approach would be just to say, I'm not going to do it. Not as an act of will, but as a manifestation of the entire being, and this is how we move, I believe, closer to God, closer to what we're intended to be, which is the image of God, and ultimately in union with God himself.
Interesting. So, just changing the subject a little bit now, I have in front of me one of your smaller tracts, or Brontomantia, on the Prognostication of Thunder, written by the Venerable Bede, a doctor of the church. I think this is one of the strangest texts I think I've ever come across by a doctor of the church. Tell me a bit more, tell the listeners a bit more about that.
Yes. So he proposes different significations to hearing different types of thunder. So he says if the thunder comes from the north or the south or the east or the west, it means this. Or if the thunder primarily occurs on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday or a Thursday or whatever, it means this. Or if the thunder is, short or in double bursts, it means this and this. Now, when you read these methods of prognostication, I don't know if it occurred to you, Brian, that it would be almost impossible to use them, because the reality is that sometimes the thunder might occur on a Monday, sometimes it might be on a Thursday, sometimes it might be from the east. But the point I believe that it makes is that you can read into nature signs. And when we read signs into nature, I don't believe that these are like objective truths. Like if you did a bunch of scientific experiments, it would show that this is really the case. But it's actually uncovering what our subconscious mind knows already, and our subconscious mind knows a lot more than we give it credit for. It knows a lot more than our conscious mind does. And I think this is the essence of medieval astrology and prognostication, that you actually open your own mind and realize what you knew already.
Like Platonic remembering, then, an anamnesis.
Yeah, well, it is. It's like you're wondering, for example, if a friendship is going to turn out well, or if a business transaction is going to go well, or even if it's going to be a storm tomorrow. I believe that on a subconscious level, due to our biological and organic instincts, we actually already know the answer of most of these questions. In the same way that, a bird knows if there's a storm coming, or ants know if it's about to rain. We know also about our human relationships, about human behavior. We might think, oh, can I trust this person or not? Or what kind of person is this? The reality is we know 99% of this already just by having seen. This is the instinct. And so I believe that the value of these medieval methods of prognostication is actually in unlocking our own instincts, in unlocking whatever you know already, And if you think, you look up into the heavens at the stars and you say, well, what do you see as happening? What you actually see is what you know to be the case already. And this is not simply a kind of pre-remembering as if we were pre-existent, but it's to do with our animal instincts, which are a lot more complex than we give them credit for, and a lot more accurate. You think about how accurately animal species can appear to tell the future. I believe that is also within human beings. We've just kind of lost touch with it, and we need particular techniques to reopen it.
Because the domination of the ratio,
it reduces our instincts, and it puts us out of touch with this tremendous resource which each of us has within us.
And you're not talking about this would sound very difficult to somebody who's trapped in a Cartesian picture of the eye inside locked away from the extension outside. But what the context of what a human being is that you're saying this applies to is one where the interior and the exterior are in some important way continuous, and that the outside world is in a very intimate relationship with the inside world, the macrocosm and the microcosm.
Absolutely. And we sometimes forget that as human beings, we in fact are part of that macrocosm. and we're a microcosm, but we're also we're not like a thing acting within the universe. We're actually part of the universe. You think, well, we say where we end, where the universe begins, basically at our skin, but that doesn't actually reflect reality at all. The reality is that there is just a continuous connection between everything. And this is spiritual as well as physical. There's really no distinction between the two, you know. I think, as a consequence of rationalism, we sometimes reduce reality simply to words and concepts. And we're dealing not with reality itself, but with words and concepts and so forth. This is where meditation becomes so important, the silencing of the internal dialogue, of basically where we stop talking to ourselves. That is what really meditation is. And most people only stop talking to themselves when they fall asleep, which is not tremendously helpful. But if you can do it when you're awake, just encounter reality as it is without giving it names, evaluations, systems, and so forth. I believe this is what St. Francis of Assisi did, for example, which is why he loved nature so much, and why for him his love of nature was not separate from his love of God, and also from his love of self, that everything was like brothers and sisters connected in this.
And in response, nature behaved in a truly unusual way. Animals behaved in ways that we're not used to.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think so much of the reason why animals are frightened of human beings or hostile towards them, and even other people, is they sense within certain individuals this kind of strong barrier, this opposition of myself, what's going on inside, even the fictional character which is driving the human body, like a little man up inside your head, and everything else. Whereas when this is put away, then suddenly things start to exist in peace. And, you know, God actually intended the universe to be in peace. He intended human beings to live in peace. So by cultivating this, you know, cultivating this meditative state, which is seeing reality as it really is. And I guarantee that if anyone does this, and probably a lot of your listeners do this already, suddenly things start to seem much more happy and peaceful and harmonious.
Amazing. Some of our more skeptical listeners might respond that the church has at various times used condemnatory language to concepts like divination. How are we to deal with that and bring it together with what you've already said?
Okay, it has put out condemnations at various points in time. So these condemnations, one of the very first ones was the practice of opening the Bible at random for a prophecy. And, you know, this was seen as, you know, not so good. Or believing also that the signs of nature were like fixed or infallible, that they offered a certain guide about what was going to happen, which of course is a mistake. Now, for example, Thomas Aquinas, he actually believed in what we would call astrology, the influence of the stars on human events. But he did say that this influence didn't take away people's free will. It wasn't like an absolutely predetermined. And I think when we look at the writings of people like the Venerable Bede and so forth, they're saying, yes, these are useful things to do. They're not giving you a like fixed or concrete result that is unchangeable. And they're not infallible either. So, you know, I think that the church is right to warn people against superstitions, which I would describe is something which is hard to describe. But I think the key thing about superstition is it's being exploited by someone for their own benefit, you know. But simply observation of the world, of nature in its totality, and forming judgments based on that is is repeatedly actually affirmed by the church as being something which is quite valid. You think about someone predicting the weather. Even if they're a scientific meteorologist, fundamentally what they're doing is saying, what do I see at the moment? And extrapolating this, what's probably going to happen next.
Right, just because it has a veneer of scientific terminology or mathematical terminology doesn't make it categorically different from trying to interpret the signs.
And, you know, Christ himself says, you know, you see the sky in the evening and it's red, and you know the next day is going to be like this. We know that the Magi, the wise men from the east, they followed a star to find the location of Christ. So, you know, scripture is filled with these type of wondrous events, with divinization, because the church says don't abuse these things. Don't allow yourself to be exploited or fooled, or don't try to take away the fact that no matter what you do, you still don't know for sure what's going to happen. So I think we should be more relaxed about this. And at the same time, you know, I think everyone should basically not be too gullible and think, oh, well, whatever anyone says must be true because they've said it. I mean, I think with all these things, we should be in the position of reading them sensitively and respectfully and seeing what they offer, but not necessarily just saying, well, it's true. And, you know, I'm certainly in this case with the prognostication by thunder. You know, my valuing of it was what I said before. It reveals what we already think or feel, more so than in any objective reality, you know. And I think in that respect, they are actually they are useful. You know?
So in some ways, the binary approach of this is absolutely good or this is absolutely bad is a very modern way of approaching it, whereas the medieval person would have discerned.
Absolutely. And, you know, science, the whole concept of science is actually a very modern evolution in thought. You think about what is basically science. It's observing something and then making conclusions or extrapolate. There's actually nothing all that objective about science. Give you a case in point, medicine. What people are saying is good for you or bad for you, or treatments, it's changing all the time, continuously. So clearly there's no objectivity at all. It's just expectations. And this is not actually so different from the medieval approach to the world, that we can't say science, it's true or subjective and so forth. And everything else is just hocus pocus. I mean, everything is just observation, response, and insight.
Interesting. And tell us a bit more about some of your other writings. What do you think is really important that you'd like the listener to know more about?
Yeah. So one of my very favorite translations is a work which is a series of visions by Saint Francis of Rome. Saint Francis of Rome was an Italian noblewoman who wanted to be a nun but was married, and after her husband's death, she set up her convent for rich and noble women. And she experienced many visions. This recounts her visions over the course of a day when she was probably suffering from a fever of some kind, but she has this extraordinary journey through the realms of hell, purgatory, and heaven. And her writing in this is absolutely so colorful and wonderful. This is a book which will change anyone's life. And it had never been translated fully into English before. There was a kind of strongly edited French version, or basically rewritten French. But it is a book which is quite frightening at points. And so I would recommend that one. And another one which came out fairly recently was The Devil's Bagpipe, The True Life of Martin Luther. And this work was written only a few years after the death of Martin Luther by someone who lived through everything and saw everything happen as it unfolds. And a lot of what people believe about Martin Luther, that he was troubled by theological concerns and his salvation and so forth, are actually complete myths. We get a picture of a very different character, a kind of power-hungry and ambitious character. And I believe that this initial spirit, this kind of wanting to trample over things which were mystical and beautiful, has infiltrated firstly Protestantism, and then from Protestantism, our entire Western culture. So we have this, rationalistic approach, which you think about it is actually kind of fundamentalistic and somewhat barbaric as well. And it's an enslaving approach. It's a disenchanting approach in a literal sense of the world. So I would pick, I think that is a very entertaining book to read. That one. So have a check out of that if you're interested, and quite a few others for Hadean Press. One, the Secret Pharmacopoeia of Pope John the 21st. And before he became Pope, he was physician to the Pope. So he was a professor of medicine. And some of the treatments in this are absolutely bizarre. Treatments involving bat's blood, crushed up frogs, swallowing the beating hearts of living birds. It's actually, I mean, I can understand why it hasn't been translated, but it is the writing of a pope, not the infallible writing of a pope, of course,
sure,
but very interesting. It shows medieval medicine at a kind of somewhat grotesque point. But I translate things. Because I translate a book doesn't necessarily mean I believe everything that's written in it. It means I believe that.
Absolutely. And it's a case, I think, in the modern church, both on the liberal and the traditional side, that we go back to the medieval and patristic period and retrieve the things that we want to retrieve and the things that we want to see. Even the more traditional side of things, side of the church is guilty of this. That they will go back to many great authors, find an excellent work on spiritual theology and translate it, but leave behind what the same writer has written in an area that we find truly bizarre.
And I often encounter this. I'm translating the life or the work of a saint, and depending upon who the publisher is, I have to leave out certain bits, whether it might be penances or practices or beliefs which they did. And I realize that, as I said, it depends upon the purpose of the book. If the book is written just for, moral instruction or pious edification, then of course we leave out some things. But if it's for a scholarly audience, then I of course include everything faithfully. And this includes notably Albert the Great. People, for a long time, he wasn't made a doctor of the church. And it was precisely because he was known to have been the author of these fairly extraordinary works on natural medicine and so forth. And, he talks about his magical texts, which he's read and things like that. So he became...
And the magical experiments that he undertook as well, not just reading.
Yeah. And so the mainstream church has either said he didn't really write these books, or it's held off on making him a doctor of the church until like 1934. And then, the same with Aquinas. There are actually alchemical works attributed to Aquinas. And he was studying translations of the work of Arabic philosophers at the time. It was reported that he knew all the sciences of his time, but the ones which don't fit in with the model often get pushed to the side. And I think this is where I come into things, because I'm fascinated by that, and I know that a lot of other people are, maybe not millions of other people, but a few. So I like to explore the things which have been left untouched for one reason or another. And as a Catholic, I basically am a great It's fair to say I'm basically traditionalist. I love the traditional liturgy, and I love the mystical side, the interior side. I think we get mistaken when we think the church or religion is just a social function. It's to promote social justice and so forth. To me, that is not so much what the church is there for. That's what governments are for. And that we need to unlock this mysticism of our own tradition. Realize that the Catholic faith is not a closed door, but rather it is eclectic, bringing in these traditions from the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Hebrews, even from further afield, and of course, from our own Western European tradition, which people are often a bit afraid to affirm explicitly because, you might seem nationalist or whatever. But I think we need to reawaken this Western spirituality. And this can't be done without the Catholic faith, which is so central to it.
That's exceptionally interesting. Thank you so much, Father Robert. And I commend to our listeners all of your translations. That there are so many in so many different areas, from biography to medicine to magical texts. So I recommend that our listeners go and explore all of these different texts. And I hope perhaps we can have you on again on the podcast, because I think it's very unusual to find a cleric who understands this. In some ways, the laity have intuited elements of the domination of rationalism to a better degree than the clerics. Even I'm just thinking of it, it's not hard to find a traditionally minded cleric who will condemn uses of sort of crystals for healing or similar activities that would have been perfectly natural to a doctor of the church like Saint Hildegard of Bingen. And yet these days, even people who have a great love for the medieval period feel uncomfortable with that. So I think it's very valuable to both ourselves on this podcast and our listeners to be able to talk to somebody who's so deeply interested in that re-enchantment, the recovery of true mysticism as it pertains to the full broadness of life.